So Rabbi Rachael Bregman is the Berman family rabbinate rabbi for historic congregation Beth Tefillah in Brunswick, Georgia, and has been since 2013. She received a BA from Boston College in Human Development and a Master's of Education from Harvard University in the same field. She was ordained a rabbi from Hebrew Union College in 2010. She grew up in the Northeast and now lives in the South, which makes for a very interesting experience. She is a hiker, a baker, and an anti-racist. Most importantly, she's a mom to a tiny human and 2 rescue dogs. Now I'm going to share my screen here so that we can say the blessing for study together. I'll invite you to join me in this blessing, after which I'll turn things right over to Rabbi Bregman. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the Eternal, whose mitzvot, whose commandments make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse or engage in words of Torah. And I'll turn things over now to Rabbi Rachael Bregman.
Thank you so much, Micah. And thank you everyone for being here. It's really wonderful to see your faces. I've been here once before, and some of you I now recognize, and some of you are faces I haven't seen in a really long time. Laura Shapiro. And then some folks here are from my congregation here in Southeast Georgia. So this is really a gift of Zoom that we can all be together at the same time and same place. We're going to study a little bit about the Divine Feminine today. We have an hour to take on a topic that we could talk about for years. So we're really not even scratching the surface, but we're going to do our best to get somewhere in our conversation today. Micah was saying to me very smartly that at some point I'm going to have to stop referring to my daughter as a tiny human because she is about to be 10 years old. And I share that with you because at some point she is leaving to go to dance class and will come in and probably come give me a hug and a kiss. So you'll get to see my kiddo. And I apologize now for the interruption. And with delight, I'm excited to share with you my tiny human who's not so tiny anymore. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Divine Feminine. And I really want to start with a question, which if my slide would advance, we can ask that question and see at the same time. Oh, right, this is what we're going to do. So we're going to talk about why a Divine Feminine matters, right? Why do we care about the idea of the Divine Feminine? How do we refer to her? And a little text at the end about where we see her, which will hopefully take us into some exploration of what the Divine Feminine is like. So I start with this question. Why do you think, and this is a please participate question, why do you think it matters how we imagine God, right? The idea of a Divine Feminine is that we have divine, God, in a feminine form, which is countercultural. What difference does it make and why? And I'm going to stop my share for a second. So if anyone wants to put up their hands, we can get some responses. Bob, go ahead. Why do you think it matters?
Well, of course, it says that God said, let us create humans in our image. So there's something there that helps us understand ourselves once we understand God in one way or another.
Right. So if we want to understand God and God's totality, then we have to understand all kinds of different kinds of people, right? Not just male, female, and gender differences, and everything in between. I don't work for the federal government, so therefore I'm allowed to acknowledge the idea that gender lives on a continuum and a spectrum. So, we're going to talk about male, female because that's our tradition. That's as far as our tradition has gotten. And also, I just want to take this moment and acknowledge that Judaism very, very clearly understands gender as being very diverse and multi-spectral. We'll just call it spectral. And that'll be a thing for a different time. Maybe Micah one day will do the 9 genders in Judaism as a thing. I see lots of people nodding their heads. Okay,
Sorry
great.
to interrupt, but that class is coming up in 2 weeks with Rabbi Nikki DeBlasi.
She's the
Same
best.
bat time, same bat or different bat channel. So sign up for that one at laasok.org.
Awesome. Oh, good. I'm glad I could do a promo for Nikki. She's amazing and is the right person to teach this stuff. Okay, so Bob, thank you so much. Yes, 100%. Amy, go ahead if you would unmute and share.
Sure can. Genesis 1:27.
Okay.
Humankind was created in God's image. So if 100% of our species is created in God's image, then does that not serve to show that God's everything we are? So if we think about our extremes as far as sex and gender go, and orientation too, all right, seems to work very well to show that God is intersex. God's
Love it.
gender queer. And
Love
God is
it.
pansexual, right?
Yes, there is totally, yes, room for all of this in the Big Ten. I love it. Thank you, Amy. Jessica, go ahead.
Sure. Just to echo what everybody said, I do agree with all of that. I think it's also important to recognize who was writing the texts at the time and who had dominant voices and control at the time, and we're
Right.
hopefully moving in a different direction now, although it's a little bit of question about that right now. But yeah, so I think it's important that we look at it through the lens of today as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. Janet.
Okay, when I first saw the title to this class, it reminded me of a book that I read, I guess about a year ago, and you may or may not be, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It was called Let There Be Light by Ilana Fink. And it's the creation story and the story of the Torah as if God were a woman, and how might the Torah have been written if God were a woman? And it was, I can't remember specifics now. I read it about a year ago, but it was really interesting to see that the tone and, men and women think differently about certain things or have a different approach or a different sensitivity or whatever. So that book immediately came to mind, and I think this topic is really interesting because there is a feminine side to God. As we said, God, like everyone has said already, if we're all created in God's image, then God has a masculine and a feminine.
Beautiful. Thank you. All right, Sheila and then Sandy, and then we'll go on. Otherwise, we'll never get anywhere. Oh, and then Laura. Laura, of course, you no, you have to. You have to. Okay, Sheila, go ahead, please. Oh, Sheila, will you unmute?
I finding the unmute was my issue.
Understood.
Everything everyone has said certainly touches the question of the feminine in the way in which we understand God.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important to distinguish between the discourse that is godly and human understanding, human discourse. God is everywhere. God is all powerful. God doesn't have a gender. One of the problems I have, and I like the idea because culturally, we've given God a gender. All you have to do is look at the second creation story.
Right.
I mean, we start out with God makes men and women, and they're equal. And in the second creation story, women are produced out of Adam's rib.
Right.
And that story is so profoundly powerful because of the millions of Christians for whom that is the creation story. They don't read the first one. So while I think it's really good to see it through our eyes, I look at God as gender free.
I love it. I love it. Right. And I think you really named that tension that we might understand God as being an entity that is beyond gender, but we as human beings interact with that entity and we are not beyond gender. And so there's this real push-pull in the human divine conversation that we're stepping into in this space. Thank
Well
you.
stated.
Thank you. Sandy, go ahead.
Thank you so much. So kudos to all who've spoken before me. I'm going to add to me that gender is on a continuum. And so if we're going to apply that to God, there's a continuum there as well that is all encompassing. But for me, the question is not about the fact that we need to be inclusive. It's about the fact that there's been an omission dating way back. So it's not that I feel the need to say, women need to be included. I think that there was an omission, and that's what started this gender parity, took away the continuum, and then we're racing to play catch up. But the truth is, it's a continuum.
Love it. Yes. Laura, it's really nice to see you.
It's great to see you. But Rabbi Bregman was an intern in my synagogue just a couple of years ago, I think. So others have already obviously said what part of what I wanted to say. I mean, the creation story of, God created humankind, male and female. God created them. So I think part of the problem is that we're stuck with Hebrew, which is such a gendered language. And there wasn't, the Israelis are working on it, but there wasn't a good way of doing a he, she, or a they, because they ends up being in the masculine as well. But I think we should realize that that's what we have in Chumash, but in Talmud, there are many genders, and it was mentioned that there's going to be a class. I mean, to me, this creating the male and female at the same time, this was a hermaphrodite who then got separated. So yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. So you guys have touched on what I think is the primary question that comes up, right? Or answer to the question of why it's so important to be inclusive in our imaginings around the divine. We've really touched on this issue around equity, right? And I want to dig a little bit into that. Just not that I thought you would anything other than totally have wonderful answers to these questions, but just for funsies, I did a little research. I did a Google visual search on the Jewish God, and right, this is what comes up, and you can see all these images are very, very male. Maimonides comes up. That's hilarious to me. Jesus comes up. Sure, why not? Maybe you'll do the search and you'll have a different algorithm and you'll get a different first few pictures, but I'm sure it won't be wildly different than my search. And then I did a search because I wanted to see what happened. I did a search for Jewish Shekhinah. So we're going to talk about the divine feminine with two names. We're going to talk about Shekhinah, and we're going to talk about Chokhmah. And I'll explain what both those are in just a minute. But just as I went and looked, and I appreciated this. I mean, we still have over here on the right hand side, we've got the priest looking at the the Holy of Holies. But largely, we've moved away from gender in this collection of images. Again, it's just the first 10 that come up. And then I also did Chokhmah, which I didn't think I needed to clarify was Jewish. Figured Google knew that already. And here we have one gendered image, and everything else is just pattern. It's just the sphirot, which comes from the Kabbalistic tradition, which we'll chat a little bit about today. So I think when we're thinking about how we imagine these things matters, because it changes how we think about God, and how we think about God deeply impacts how we think about each other. So first, let's look a little bit at the feminist perspective, right? As was mentioned in the late, really starting in like the mid 70s, but gaining momentum into the late 70s and the early 80s. There's a huge movement within the Jewish world, a Jewish feminist movement. You have all kinds of incredible thinkers and speakers who are just the greats of our faith tradition today, who are trying to figure out how do we be inclusive of the idea of God as female. And the first thing they really had to do was overcome the idea of God being exclusively male. Right? Once upon a time, the idea of God as God, let alone, God is not he, even just God as a totally neutral form, is sort of outrageous. Or it was. I hope it's not so outrageous now. So here's this little piece of text from this piece of study from the Catholics, from actually about gender. We were not the only ones who were trying to figure this out. about gender. And what I think is important here about this piece by Elizabeth Johnson is that she brings up three very damaging things that happen when we only think of the divine in one singular form. Okay. And I want to be clear, I don't think it matters what form we think of the divine in. If it's singular, then we're going to do damage to anybody who's not that form. Okay. So this isn't my, you know, women on top, men on the bottom. Like, I'm not that kind of feminist. I'm a third wave feminist, fifth wave feminist now. Who knows what it is? I just want there to be equity. So, and we see this problematized. So, here's what Elizabeth Johnson said. Right, the critique brought by women theologians against the exclusive centrality of the male image and idea of God is not only that in stereotyping and then banning female reality as suitable reference points for God, but androcentric thought has denigrated the human dignity of women. The critique also bears directly on the religious significance and ultimate truth of androcentric thought about God. The charge, quite simply, is that of idolatry. So just to clarify, right, by only focusing on men, we say that the non-male experience doesn't count, that we deny the humanity of people who aren't male, and bluntly put, by only making God in one image, that becomes a form of idolatry, which is anathema to our faith tradition. Idolatry is a big no-no throughout time and space. And so we want to be careful about not being idolatrous by not worshiping this one particular form of the God that we've worked so hard through time and space to be formless. And I find that point particularly striking. Now, moving forward a little bit in time, we have a piece here that is written by Judith Plaskow. It came from the Jewish Women's Archive. And she makes this beautiful point. Judith Plaskow, if you don't know, wrote Standing Again at Sinai, and is probably like, I mean, I think of her as sort of the queen of the Jewish feminist movement, but certainly a queen in a very robust court. And she'll reference some of the other greats here in this article. So Judith Plaskow wrote, in an article first published in 1979, but circulating earlier, Rita Gross, who's pictured here on the right, argued that the Jewish failure to develop female imagery for God is the ultimate symbol of the degradation of Jewish women. Right? So we're repeating that from before. She maintains that because exclusively male language for God reflects and reinforces a male-centered definition of humanity, women would be fully included in the Jewish covenant community only were God also addressed as God, she. Right? So if you want women to be part of Judaism, then the feminine aspect has to be part of God. And she goes on to say, Gross goes on to say, that the familiar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, which is a turn of phrase regularly used throughout Jewish tradition. In fact, in a lot of sacred texts, you'll see it as an acronym, right? Hey, Kuf, Bet. That terminology is also Hakrusha Bruchahi, the Holy One, blessed be She. And it always has been that way. That it was given early liturgical expression by Naomi Janowitz and Maggie Wenig. In 1976, I love this, as undergraduates at Brown University, they wrote an English language Shabbat prayer book that referred to God throughout using female pronouns and imagery. Like, this is outrageous in 1976. Sally Priesand, the first female rabbi, is ordained in 1975, right? So this is all like very, very cutting edge and is not very old stuff, right? But what I think is really important is that what we see here is these are all people who are fighting in the course of history for greater equity, for greater human equity, right? We want men and women to be equal. We want us to be seen as equal. We want God to be part of that conversation. We can't be equal if God is not inclusive of all of us in all different kinds of ways. If anyone has any questions, I have no way to see you raising your hand because all I can see is the shared screen. So if you have something that you want to say, oh, Janet Shapiro has raised your hand. Great. Janet, what's your question?
Yes. Now when we say a lot of the prayers, in addition to saying the fathers, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we say Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. Obviously an outgrowth of all of this. When did that hit the prayer books.
I believe that that's very, when it hits it hits the prayer books a lot later than it hits the people. So people start adopting that tradition, I believe, in the early 80s, and I don't think you see it. I know, Micah, if you have a guess here, jump on in. Or if somebody wants to Google it in the background and let us know. But I don't think you see the matriarchs in a prayer book in a mainstream movement prayer book for quite some time.
Yeah, I want to say that Kol HaNeshama, the Reconstructionist prayer book, might be the first, which I think is around 1990. 94, it makes it into Gates of Prayer, the revised edition. I remember the debate over it at camp in the mid 80s, but I agree prayer book wise, probably 1990 something.
Yeah, right. So even though we were doing it, Micah, were you a Camp Ramah kid?
No, I was at Reform Camp.
You're at Reform Camp. So I grew up at Camp Ramah. And we were doing, maybe we weren't doing the matriarchs, but like, growing up in the 80s, we were starting to see that used. Sabrina, go ahead.
I wanted to just add the notion that not only equity, but also our own relationship with God, how close we can feel to God depends on how
Yeah.
we consider, what image of God we have. I did not feel close to God when I thought of God as a big old white man.
Right. Right. As a rabbi practicing in the field for the last 15 years, I'm coming up on 15 years. One of the things that I see over and over and over again is people who are coming back to Judaism, and one of the biggest hurdles, one of the biggest things that pushed them away was God, He, and exclusively God, He, and God, old white man on the throne, beard, right, like that very Santa Claus kind of looking character, and being able to have conversations in the lived world about God doesn't have to be any one thing. I think has really opened up people's ability to connect with the divine, to connect Judaism, and to connect with each other, which I think is huge and really powerful, right? Really deepening that sense of our own relationship with the sacred, which is what I want, right? I'm interested in the divine feminine because I want us to have deep relationships with the sacred, and I think that this is an aspect of humanity, and so therefore we need to touch on it within a divine a space. Okay, so we looked a little bit at the feminist background. Now I want to look at the little bit of the mystical piece, because I think the mystical piece adds in something else to our conversation that I think is really valuable. So, share my slide. Okay, great. All right, so we looked at a spiritual perspective. Oh, we looked at a feminist perspective, now looking at a spiritual perspective. So I really love Rabbi Rami Shapiro, who is like this deeply spiritual character in the world today. And he wrote a book about the divine feminine, and it is a place that I have gone to for a lot of learning. So I'm bringing a bunch of material from him because he really has been an expert and a leader in stepping into the divine feminine from a spiritual place as opposed to from a feminist place, right? And I want us to tease those apart just a little bit. They don't look really so different, but recognizing that like Rami Shapiro is a white man and that he can bring the divine feminine into the Jewish world. He can bring it in a different way than I can as a woman. It makes him a really wonderful ally, and I'm grateful to him for the work that he has done. So here's what Rami Shapiro says in thinking about the lack of the feminine within the divine. He writes, I cannot reconcile the God who says, love your neighbor as yourself, with the God who says it's permissible to kill a person who picks up sticks on a Saturday. I find it much more logical to believe the first comes from Mochin de Gadlut, which is spacious mind. We all, I think, know what spacious mind is when you're thinking in a way that is broad and full and from a place of plenty. While the second comes from Mochin de Katnut, which is narrow mind, often coming from a place of lack of fear and anxiety. The texts that come from narrow mind are fear-based. They serve to enforce the power of the few over the many. The teachings that come from spacious mind are rooted in love and compassion and serve to establish justice irrespective of rank. So wisdom does not serve anyone's quest for power and control over others. Her gift, now we're personifying wisdom, chokhmah, is power and control over yourself. So what I love here is that Rabbi Shapiro is looking at our faith tradition and saying, look, we've got all of it in there, right? We've got the good, the bad, and the ugly. One of the conversations we regularly have at my congregation when we do text study, particularly when my father is there, who I believe my dad is here in the Zoom room somewhere, he will regularly ask, like, why do we include that, right? That part is ugly or messy, right? Like Rami Shapiro referenced stoning people who pick something up on Shabbat. Right? That's not how we think of Judaism. That's not how I think of Judaism. That's not how we treat one another. We would never stone each other. Like, not how we do it. How do we make sense of that? So Rabbi Shapiro is talking about this mystical idea around it being coming from an expansive place versus coming from a narrow place, and really humanizes all of our texts. Now he goes on to say a bit more about the divine feminine. Right? The original language of our sacred texts, both Hebrew and Greek, make it very clear. Wisdom is known in Hebrew as chokhmah and Greek as Sophia. They are both feminine nouns. The authors of the wisdom books took this gender specificity seriously and envisioned wisdom as mother, God's consort and bride, the divine feminine through which the masculine God fashioned all of creation. Further, they saw in the union of masculine and feminine a powerful analogy for the greater unity of all, in the ineffable Godhead that transcends our imagination. So that's a lot of language to say that, whoops, didn't want to do that yet. That's a lot of language to say that one of the things that comes out of the spiritual tradition is focusing on the divine feminine from a place of unity, right? Not so much even just about equity, although that is there too, but that if you want to do Jewish, right? If you want to lean into the Jewish faith tradition, you have to understand people as being one, as being echad, right? That is central point to all of what Judaism is about, is all of our unity. And by bringing in the divine feminine, we are necessarily more inclusive and therefore more unified. And I think it's a really brilliant point that that the mystics make, and that Rabbi Shapiro really highlights. I do want to say this about the mystics. The mystics in their quest for unity did not also follow a quest for equity. And so while you see the rise of the feminine historically through the mystical spiritual tradition, you do not see a rise in the female. And I want to separate feminine from female for a little bit of this conversation, right? Understanding feminine as an aspect of self. Every being has some parts feminine, some parts masculine. We live in a balance of these different identities, right? Regardless of the bodies that we're in, that we understand God as being, as having that, having all of it and everything in between, or maybe none of it, right? But the mystics didn't translate that into the actual human beings. And for me, I find that as a point of regular frustration with the mystical tradition. Like, brilliant that they could really value the feminine, but it did not mean that they really valued women. So we're still working on that piece. So I'm gonna pause here. Any questions? I see that there's been a bunch that's been written in the chat. So I'm not gonna have a chance to read, but if anyone wants to share anything, ask any questions. Okay, I'm gonna go on then. So let's talk about how we know the divine feminine in these two faith traditions, these two traditions, right? The mystical, the spirit, the feminist, excuse me, the feminist and the spiritual. Okay. So what's her name, right? So I have these different images. The ones on the top are of the Shekhinah, and the ones on the bottom, there was no actual physical embodied person, but just the word Chokhmah written in this beautiful artistic form. So when we look at the Torah, God as a feminine, God as she, right? God as pronoun she doesn't come up in the Torah. But we do within the Torah text have the building of the Mishkan. And there's an idea that comes later, after Torah times, in early rabbinic thought, that the Shekhinah, the female aspect of God, dwells within the Mishkan. Okay, so the Mishkan is the tabernacle. It's the, the portable ark. I mean, portable in air quotes, right? This huge, massive structure that the freed Israelites carry through the wilderness, and the place where the tablets live, right? The broken and the whole tablets, according to rabbinic tradition. What I think is really wonderful to think about is that the word Mishkan has the same root as Shekhinah, right? Shin, Chet, Nun, and it means to dwell. So Mishkan is the indwelling place of the divine, and the Shekhinah is the aspect of God that dwells with all of us. And it's just really lovely to think about. I think it's really lovely to think about God living with us, right? But God being with us. We just read in the Torah, not last week, but the week before, Vayasuli mikdash, make for me a holy place. V'shachanti, I will dwell betocham, amongst you. Right. So this idea of God wanting a home with us is definitely in the Torah, but the Shekhinah herself, the female aspect of God, isn't explicitly talked about. We do start to understand the Shekhinah in rabbinic literature as a protector, right? That whenever we're in exile, the Shekhinah is with us, that when somebody is ill, that presence that we feel is the Shekhinah, the divine presence we feel is the Shekhinah, that there's this divine thread, that when we study, when you have this moment, like when you're having a really deep, amazing conversation with somebody else and you feel the sacred, our rabbinic tradition holds that aspect of God would be the Shekhinah that is there, right? When people gather, when three sit as judges, when people come together, there's a sense of something sacred that is happening, and that's the Shekhinah. She gets to like sort of sit there with all of us. There's also this piece about when people come together, right, in coupledom. This is from Tractate Shabbat. This is a very ancient text, and so it's very gender specific, and we don't have to necessarily read it that way. But oh, sorry, I jumped ahead. Ignore what I just said about gender, although it does count. This really lovely piece from Tractate Shabbat. The Shekhinah rests on a person, neither through gloom, nor through sloth, nor through frivolity, nor through levity, nor through talk, nor through idle chatter, but only through a matter of joy and connection with a mitzvah. So we have this idea in our tradition that the feminine aspect of the divine is the aspect that shows up when we are engaged in things that are and joyful acts of celebrating our faith tradition. And now this piece about man and woman, right? And I just want to say this in terms of coupledom, because Talmud is 6th century at the latest kind of text. Gender sexual orientation was not something they were particularly conscious or mindful of, but we can evolve from that, right? So we have when two people merit, the Shekhinah is between them if they come together, and if not, fire consumes them. Like, that's very terrifying to me. Like, if you partner with someone, it's the wrong person, then it's just going to all blow up. But when it does happen, when you match with somebody and it's right, that there's this holy fire that comes forth. And when we think about our experience in the wilderness, right, we are led through the wilderness. Here's Cecil B. DeMille's version of being led through the wilderness. Moses right there, right? We're led by this holy fire. So you can see how the holy fire that was there and the evolution of the Shekhinah as being the holy fire leads into this idea of thinking about the presence that is with the Jewish people in exile as being the Shekhinah, as being the holy fire, right? These ideas are all weaving into each other and leading one another. While the rabbi of the Talmud, this is from Leah Novick, who wrote a book. This is the book that I thought you were going to mention before, On the Wings of Shekhinah, Rediscovering Judaism's Divine Feminine. While the rabbis of the Talmud did not explicitly identify Shekhinah as feminine, many of the attributes they ascribe to her are common to ancient goddesses: love, compassion, justice, and healing. If we had infinite time, I would pause here and show you a bunch of texts from the Torah of places that God is referred to with feminine ideas. I'm just going to ask you to trust me that they're out there, and I'm going to call on you, Micah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just really interested in this image of fire that you raised a minute ago, because fire, I mean, as we know, fire is both the source of civilization and also something very destructive.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to me that the rabbis are describing God as fire, as the Torah does. God is a pillar of fire that leads us. But then, when they think about, I think if I understood correctly, when they think about a sort of a constructive fire, the Shekhinah, then they think about it in feminine language,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the Shekhinah as a fire of passion, sort of a fire of goodness, versus the destructive kind of fire that is, I have the language over here in front of me, that is consumed by that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that they're just sort of they're playing with different images, some masculine, some feminine, and imagining God as sometimes masculine, violent, destructive fire, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes sort of like a burning, passionate fire, which seems to be a more feminine image for them.
100%. And I think you're speaking to the idea that so much of this imagery and so much of these pieces are here within our text tradition, and they are embedded within them. And so much of what we get to do in modernity is to tease them out more fully. The other thing that I want to say, which might be a slightly radical thing to say, is drawing parallels between blood and fire, and that women in blood and women in fire. That's a whole other conversation because women bleed, right? Because we bleed and we don't die, right, has always been a point of consternation and confusion for the very male rabbinic mind. And fire has that same feeling, right? Moses in the wilderness and he sees the bush and the bush is not consumed, right? Fire that burns but doesn't kill, blood that bleeds that doesn't kill, right? There's like a way that those things come together in this feminine place. And so there's some part about the feminine that is definitely deeply like comforting and caring, but also there's a piece about the feminine that's really dangerous and terrifying, like awe-inspiring, awe and fear kind of being side by side. So I just want to throw that out there into the mix of things that we can think about. Bob, go ahead, and then I'll start to bring us home.
Another aspect of this image that's always appealed to me, and maybe this is more appropriate for the program in a couple of weeks, is when you have this image of God as standing above the world like the Colossus of Rhodes, with Chachma and Bina and the right arm and left arm, and you've got the legs and all of this sort of thing. The Shekhinah that hangs down to the earth is right between God's legs.
Yes. Okay. So you jumped ahead, which is great. Thank you, Bob. I will pay you later for setting that up so nicely. That was perfect. So let's jump over to the spiritual place, right? We're, of course, going to look at this spherotic chart. And so as Bob was referencing, right? So I'll just show it to you. We have the spherot, right? So the mystics have this idea. Oh, hey, Kayla. The mystics have this idea about the 10 aspect Godhead, which like was really a brave idea once upon a time to think about God as having multiple facets, but I think it's very human, right? We have multiple facets. Why shouldn't God have multiple facets? Right. So here it is. This is the spherotic chart, and we start here at the top. This is Keter. This is crown. The first sphera or circle is Chokhmah, which is the Hebrew word for wisdom, right? It's the Greek equivalent to Sophia, who we think of being very much a woman, very much the feminine, right? And then from Chokhmah, we have Bina, which is understanding, and Da'at, which is knowledge. So we'll come back to these three ideas in just a second, because it's so fascinating to me that the first three sphirot are all about our brains. But to Bob's point, down here at the bottom is Malchut, which is the more physical world, and Malchut, which means kingship, oddly enough, is paired with the Shekhinah, with the feminine aspect. And so you have this sort of thing at the bottom that dangles down between the legs of this image and enters into the opening of the world, right? It's very gendered.
Where do you put my dance stuff?
Hold on. Your dance stuff is on your desk, and your other dance stuff is in the bag on the door. Okay, that's my child. That you have this very male-female gender piece, but it's all again about unity, right? You have the masculine exiting and entering into the feminine, right? It is hypersexualized, but it's about these two aspects coming together, and through the coming together that we build a greater sense of unity in the world and beyond, right? So the job to get done is to unify masculine and feminine energies through our human interactions. Our job is equanimity. Our job is to find balance, right? Within each of us, finding a balance between the feminine and masculine, between the right and the left, between judgment and compassion, right? These are all just very well thought out threads of thought within the Jewish tradition. So these first three emanations from the Sfirot, and if that doesn't make any sense to you, please just raise your hand and I'll use different words, right? But that there's the idea that the divine moves into the physical world through this like 10 circled entity of the Sfirot, and that's how we get made. It's very metaphysical, very mystical, very out there when you try to talk about it in very concrete terms. So a lot of it is just like, just go with it. But this thinking is here, right? So Chokhmah, just to clarify, is the second of the 10 Sfirot in Kabbalah and represents the first power of conscious intellect and subtle manifestations. The first piece where God is going from pure divine into a more physical kind of form, which is the whole process going through the 10 Sfirot. Emerging from Keter's pure potentiality. It embodies wisdom coming from nothingness, which is a line straight out of the book of Job, is that wisdom comes from nothingness. And so that's why we start with Chokhmah. The Chokhmah, that wisdom, then gets sort of more refined into Bina and Da'at, right? Which is, again, knowledge and understanding and knowledge. And I just want to point out that if you look at the first three letters of these first three Sfirot, you spell the word Chabad. So if you're familiar with Chabad, with the Jewish outreach organization Chabad, Chabad comes out of this deeply mystical tradition where they're looking at the top three Sfirot and this place of like making sense of God as sort of their main primary focus. And I find that so fascinating because it changes how I think about Chabad. We have brand new Chabad who've just arrived down here in Brunswick, Georgia. So I'm thinking a lot about Chabad just right now. Anyway, neither here nor there if you're not thinking about Chabad. I just think that's really, really cool. Okay, so yes, Yehudis. Unmute and talk with us,
Yes.
please.
Yeah, thank you. I happen to be a member of Chabad, so I appreciate that reference. But I just wanted to point out an explicit reference in the Torah to the feminine comes up next week with the para aduma, and the way the rabbis say it, let the mother come and clean up the mess of the child, referring to the Egel HaZahav. So that's a very clear, positive image of the feminine.
Yeah, there's a few of them. You have God as a birthing parent. You have God as a nursing parent, right? There's a lot of parental imagery. You have God as nurturer. There's one reference to God as like a pregnant warrior. I think that's probably my favorite one of all, right? Like just amazing what is in the text that until somebody says, hey, look here, we can very easily just gloss over them and move past these beautiful images of God as feminine, feminism, the feminine embodied. Yeah, Paige, go ahead, unmute and share.
I'm curious about the references to Asherah in the Torah. Is that from like an I know kind of there was a period of time where Judaism, the peoples were a little bit more henotheistic than monotheistic. So is the Asherah kind of goddess that is mentioned, is that from another kind of, tradition that's not Jewish, or is that something that was stamped out as kind of like a divine feminine aspect of God that we now just no longer recognize?
Yeah, I think that largely, without going deep into this and without looking at it too much first, that largely that reference comes up when talking about idols of gods in the other traditions. But we do have reference to God as El Shaddai, right? El means God, but Shaddai is breasts. So,
Okay.
and it's built on a goddess from other ancient traditions, right? Like, we watch this evolution in the Torah of going from multi-theism and idols and right into this monotheistic thing, right? There's a whole process going on there. So there's a lot of other faith traditions who have these gods and goddesses around. And so I think we end up hearing them. And I what I understand is that our term for God, as we think of monotheistic God, the term of El Shaddai is a borrow from one of these other parallel communities that we're living alongside in this time, 4,000 something years ago.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so now, because I want to get to look at the Genesis text for 4 seconds. That's all we're going to do is 4 seconds of Genesis text. Okay. Okay, bye. Have fun. I got to talk to these people about Genesis. Oh yeah, let me go. Love you. Bye, honey bunny.
Wait, Mama, when am I gonna see you? Are you gonna pick me up for class?
I'll pick you up from class. Okay, bye. Okay. Okay, we're going to skip that. So where we meet her. Okay, so creation, right? So here we are, Genesis 1:27. Thank you so much, those of you who referenced this beautiful line of text before. God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God did God create it. Male and female, God created them. Right, so this is the Everett Fox translation. As you can see, I took all of the gender references to God out in the way that I read it. Everett Fox does not, because he is looking at, as somebody else said, how the Hebrew is very, very gendered, right? But we have this idea of all of us being created in the image of God, and that necessarily within that image of God, there is something feminine, there is something masculine, that's all mixed in there. Right? So now here's what it says in Proverbs. And then I want to tie these two pieces together. Proverbs says, chapter 8, 22 through 31. I was created at the beginning of God's course, as the first of the works of old. Right? This is wisdom herself speaking. In the distant past, I was fashioned at the beginning, at the origin of earth. There was still no deep when I was brought forth, no springs rich in water. Before the foundations of the mountains were sunk, before the hills, I was born. Earth and fields had not yet been made, or the world's first clumps of clay. I was there when the heavens were set into place, when the horizon was fixed upon the deep, when the heavens above were made firm and the fountains of the deep gushed forth, when the sea was assigned its limits so that its waters never transgress God's command. When the foundation of the earth were fixed, I was with God as a confidant, a source of delight every day, rejoicing before God at all times, rejoicing in God's inhabited world, finding delight with mortals. Now, children, listen to me. Happy are they who keep my ways. I find this, first of all, just totally amazing and beautiful and awesome. I just want to read it over and over and over again. The idea of the world being made with such intentionality and such delight and such beauty, and that there was this wisdom that was there, right? Which goes back to that idea from the mystical tradition that you have the divine, and the very first piece of the divine sort of seeping out into something that could be held by humanity comes through wisdom, who is there from the very, very get-go. So we have these two other lines, right? Also from Proverbs, which we know whenever we read Torah, we sing this. Eitz Chaim hi l'machazikim ba. She is a tree of life to those who grasp her, and ever holds on to her is happy. We think of that as Torah in our liturgy, but of course Torah is the source of wisdom. So these two get put together. And then, of course, this other line, which I can barely see because there's this little mark. Okay, here we go. Darcheha darchei noam v'kol netivotecha shalom. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all of her paths of peace. Right? Like, amazing. This is what we want to grasp onto. We want to grasp onto wisdom. We want to grab onto this tree of life, because that is where we find joy. However, we're going to go back to Rami Shapiro here. The book of Genesis makes it very clear that God expels the first earthlings from the Garden of Eden, lest they grasp hold of and take from the tree of life at the center of the garden. Right? How do we reconcile these things? That says on the one hand in Proverbs, you've got to hold on, but in Genesis says, don't touch it. Yet here we are told that wisdom herself is a tree of life, and that the whole point of life is to grab hold of her and become one with her. Why the difference? This bit of Genesis speaks from a place of fear, the place of machin to katnut that we talked about before, narrow mind. Proverbs in this case speaks from the place of love, the place of mochin de gadlut, of spacious mind. Narrow mind is afraid of what will happen if you grasp hold of the tree of life. Not that you'll live forever, stuck in an endless timeline of moment after moment, but that you will slip out of time into eternity, out of self and into self, out of narrowness into spaciousness. This is the promise of Mother Wisdom, pleasantness and peace in the eternal now. So I wanted to end there with these texts to think about, we have all these traditions all mixed together, that when we're able to come into the world and think about it from a place of expansiveness, that is leaning into the divine feminine. That right now in the world that we are in, where we're very much, a lot of is happening that comes from the place of narrow mind and fear, that our spiritual move is to stay in the place of expansiveness, to balance the narrow with the expansive, and to lean into the sense of the feminine, of being fierce, of being generous, of being kind, of being loving, and being nurturing. And I'm going to stop there because I could talk about this for 4 more days. We have 5 minutes. Does anyone want to have anything that they want to say? Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I hope that this all held together in a very short 1 hour blast of Divine Feminine 101. And I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you might have.
Feel free to raise hands if there are any questions or comments. While we're waiting for people to raise their hands, let me just mention again, we do have another pertinent class in 2 weeks, Beyond Adam and Eve with Rabbi Nikki de Blasi, and you can go to the La'asok website and sign up for that. Also free and drop in just like this. And if you enjoy this class and this kind of learning, I would invite you to head over to the La'asok website and consider making a donation to support this kind of inclusive, progressive Jewish learning. I'll just drop that into the chat. We do fund this kind of learning entirely through donations. So if you enjoy this and you want to see us expand it, please consider supporting La'asok. Now, Rabbi Bregman, I think you have a hand up over there.
Bob, go ahead if you would unmute and share.
I have unmuted and having retired from the medical profession, I think not just about an expansive mind and a narrow mind, but the structure of human beings' pelvises. And a woman has a expansive pelvis, one that can handle childbirth, and a man's tends to be more narrow, or at least some interacting part there is more narrow, and maybe this relates in that way too to the expansiveness of
I love your mindfulness about the human body and how these pieces play into it, because the mystics especially were really tuned in to women as vessel and man as penetrative, right? And as ejaculative. I mean, they really, really went to town with that imagery 100%. So you would have fit right in 10th century spot and would have been just one of the guys there. Yehudis.
Yeah, you made this reference to the mystics, the original mystics, who are more out there. So the focus on the masculine and feminine distinction was much more absolute. But I think it moved into Hasidic realm. I'm writing a book now of Hasidic perspectives of the feminine. So you see a more and more, once there's a focus on earthiness, there's much more openness to the feminine contribution to everything. So.
Right. No surprise, right? We think of Earth as Mother Earth, right? Yeah, Yehudis, I would like to read your book, please. Anyone else? We have 1 minute. Anybody have any last comments that they'd like to make? Well, then I will make a last comment. I want to thank everyone for coming out today or logging in today and being here. I really enjoyed putting this together. It has been a delight, and I'm very excited to re-engage in the thought in this moment, which has been, we live in some pretty crazy times. Figuring out how to live in these moments in a way that feels deeply spiritual and deeply sacred is something that I know I'm struggling with. And getting to dig into this material has been very cathartic for me and very healing for me in thinking about how to move ahead and to hold all that expansive space that's necessary to be able to hang on in these moments. So I hope that has been inspiring or helpful or supportive for you as well, because I think we're all struggling on this path. So thank you for being here.